The former US Vice President Dick Cheney has died at the age of 84 from complications of pneumonia and cardiovascular disease. Cheney was appointed Secretary of Defense by President George H.W. Bush. That was in 1989. Over a decade later, he was picked as running mate by President George W. Bush in both the 2000 and 2004 elections. Well, Cheney had a central role in the wake of the September 11th terror attacks. He later supported the ill-fated 2003 invasion of Iraq. Critics suggesting that Cheney was the real driving force and the real power behind the Bush administration. Let's talk a bit more about Cheney's legacy. I'm joined in the studio by France 24's Angela Diffley from International Affairs Desk. Angela, Dick Cheney then had a huge influence, it has to be said, on US foreign policy, even though he was just vice president.
Yeah, he was by no means one of these sidekick vice presidents. He was really, very many people said, the brains behind certainly George W. Bush's administration. He, as you said, he'd been defense secretary under Bush Sr., George W.'s father, and been behind two quite successful operations there, the ousting of Daniel Noriega in Panama and the ousting of Saddam Hussein after he invaded Kuwait. And those two operations seem to have emboldened him, really, because he was behind what happened next. When after 9/11, Osama bin Laden destroyed the Twin Towers, the initial American response was to retaliate against Afghanistan, where bin Laden was being harboured by the Taliban. And Dick Cheney was really the person who pivoted the direction of the response of the United States towards Iraq. And a lot of people would say nowadays that had the United States stayed focused on the war in Afghanistan, it might have achieved something instead of the very ignominious pullout 2 or 3 years ago, having achieved not a great deal. Instead, he persuaded George W. Bush that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, that Saddam Hussein should have been killed the first time around when he had invaded Kuwait, and that it would be a good idea to make sure he was toppled this time, and that America would be bringing democracy by force to that whole region, which was, in America's view, a mess and in need of reshaping. And he was the person who persuaded Bush to go through with this. All of White House insiders and subsequent historians appear to agree that he was the driving force behind this. It later emerged as well, in the intervening period when Clinton had been in power, Dick Cheney wasn't really in Washington and worked for a major US oil company, Halliburton. It later emerged that the Iraq operation, Halliburton were to get the contracts to rebuild Iraq's oil industry. He himself was to get $500,000. It's unclear to what extent that was a driving, motivating factor, or was it just an extra benefit for him. But in any case, it somewhat damaged his reputation. But it is hard to overestimate how important he was in pushing forward that operation. He was a real hawk all the way through, and even in areas when the US was very criticized for waterboarding, a form of torture where they pushed prisoners' heads underwater to try to extract information from them. He never condemned it and said that it was enhanced interrogation technique and that sometimes that had to be done. So a very hawkish foreign policy under him.
So a controversial figure. Just a quick thought as to how Cheney's views would fit into today's world, if you will.
Yes, it's an interesting idea because really after the Iraq War, America's intervention in Iraq with a coalition of many other countries, most historians, or certainly very many historians, both who might lean Democrat or lean Republican in their interest in these matters, might judge that that war was a mistake. And because of that, America didn't achieve what it wanted to, at any rate. Because of that, those neocons, those interventionist foreign policy makers really began to dwindle, and this isolationist idea really took hold that America should stay out of the outside world. You see it under Barack Obama and very much so under Trump. It will be very interesting to hear what Donald Trump says about Dick Cheney's death. We had a very fulsome tribute from, his president of the time, George W. Bush, because aside from foreign policy, at the end of his life, Dick Cheney said that Donald Trump was the greatest threat to the Republic, the greatest individual threat to the Republic that America had ever seen.
All right, Angela, International Affairs Editor, thank you very much.